It's 2022, and at this point, it's impossible to imagine the gaming landscape without the Souls-like genre. From Software has been a giant in that space, and for obvious reasons, but smaller companies have tried to capture that same lightning in a bottle. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, welcome to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're diving into a brand new Souls-like action RPG, Steelrising, to find out if it's worth your time. Right off the bat, we need to acknowledge something. Elden Ring exists, and it's incredible, and even if it didn't, From Software has been paving the way for the Souls genre for almost 2 decades. Their games have helped define what the genre is by modern standards. Steelrising isn't Elden Ring, and that's okay, because to objectively look at any Souls game not made by From Software, you need to divorce that idea from your head so you can truly analyze a game from the right perspective. Now with that out of the way, let's shift our focus to the star of today's review, Steelrising. Created by the French developer Spiders, you might be familiar with some of their other games, namely Greedfall. Their recent games run off their proprietary Silk engine, and that makes the gameplay experience feel a bit different than maybe some other games on the market. It's not a bad thing by any stretch, I just wanted to make sure you had that in mind as we talk about the systems within the game. Steelrising's concept is what first intrigued me about the title. It takes place in an alternate Paris around the end of the 18th century. The French Revolution was put down by a tyrannical king, and now his army of automatons runs rampant across the city. You play as Aegis, an almost sentient automaton and a gift to Marie Antoinette. In the very first minutes of the game, she sets you on a journey to stop the king at all costs, and without hesitation, you're on your way to overthrow a dictator. It's an interesting story, made more interesting by some recognizable characters from history, such as Lafayette. I will admit I did have a bit of a hard time following every beat of the story. I understood it from a macro level, but the developers lean into their French roots, injecting language and names that I personally just had a hard time following. This is not a knock by any stretch, but as a native English speaker, it did dilute the impact of the story just a bit. Even still, the macro story, while not a work of narrative brilliance, was interesting enough to help pull the experience along. I couldn't help feel like I was just a puppet, a means to an end, but every interaction basically had some human telling me to clear a path all by myself. Obviously, I don't want to spoil anything for people that might be interested in the lore and the story, but if you wrap your head around the idea that you as Aegis are a one-machine revolution, I think you'll understand where the developers are trying to go. What won me over, at first, was the city of Paris itself. Your adventures take place in different parts of the capital. You'll move from street to street, fighting automatons, occasionally stumbling into a slightly different environment. While I liked the setting, by the end of my experience, it all felt a bit samey. Every alley started to resemble the one I had just left, and even the ornate palaces started to blur together as I got further into the game. The environments themselves were nice to look at, but not altogether that interesting to explore. And this is where I actually had a pretty big issue with the game. There are so many random dead ends and blocked passageways that I felt it almost pulled me out of the experience. The worst part is you're never really rewarded for your efforts of exploration. Sure, you'll run across the occasional item or maybe even a chest, but I never felt the developers were encouraging my curiosity. To be clear, Steelrising isn't an open world game, but within each level, you do have free reign to go wherever you want. Each level is more or less a maze, and on multiple occasions, I tried to exploit that design, searching through every nook and cranny, but after a while, once the thrill of finding that same small item wore off, I lost that drive to keep exploring. Now that's enough about the story and the world, it's time to talk about the action, because truth be told, Spiders is doing quite a lot to try and make Steelrising stand out as an action RPG. Because the game is built on this idea of Victorian-era clockwork machinery, you don't have your traditional swords and shields, and I rather enjoyed that aspect of the game. Every weapon I ran across, for the most part, felt new and interesting, and while balance was a pretty big issue, I really enjoyed trying out a variety of weapons. I think it's important to point out that the combat flows a bit differently in Steelrising. It's faster paced and rewards aggression, especially if the player works in quick and strong attacks. By the end of my time with the main story, roughly 20 hours or so, I was going toe-to-toe with pretty much any enemy that got in my way. What's a bit odd is the game's dodging system. It's not about timing that perfect iframe because As far as I can tell, it was inconsistent at best, downright non-existent at its worst. What you can do, pretty easily in my mind, is just simply dodge backwards. Most enemies have extremely telegraphed and easy to read moves, and 9 times out of 10, a quick step or two backwards got you out of harm's way. Now, the pace of the combat is only possible because of the game's stamina system. As you attack, dodge, perform specials, your stamina bar depletes. When it completely empties, Aegis overheats. Now, to cool things, there is a small minigame that allows you to replenish your stamina bar quickly. If you trigger the mechanic while the bar is full, you can jump right back into the action. You do take some frost buildup, which can immobilize you if you're not careful, but ultimately, this system allows Aegis to stay in combat nearly the entire time she's engaged in a fight. It's fun, and a different approach to combat, and I rather enjoyed that. As far as weapons go, well, you have quick attacks that you can chain together in combinations, but they also have more powerful attacks that oftentimes lean into the weapon's unique characteristics. It's not like every weapon was a completely new creation. There are weapon types that define each item in the game, but because we're talking about non-standard equipment, I enjoyed the act of discovery and experimentation. Weapons also have a unique special attack. These come in all different varieties, from powerful charge-up attacks to simple counterattacks that allow you to deflect and redirect incoming blows. I found this extra layer to the combat really neat, especially when exploring each of the different weapon offerings. I will say balance across the board was a bit all over the place, especially when you're talking about specific weapons like the falchion and saber, the special attack being leaps and bounds better than some other options. Overall, though, there's a lot to play around with that will speak to pretty much every type of player. Many of the weapons also feed into the game's unique status effect system. You've got fulmination, frost, and fire, and all three can be serious boons in combat. I leaned heavy into frost because when you build up enough frost damage on an enemy, they completely seize up, giving you ample amounts of time to take them down. This even works on bosses, and that kind of surprised me because it really allows the players to cheese pretty much every encounter within the game. I do think we need to pause here and talk quickly about cheesing, because if there's one thing I really took issue with in Steelrising, it was how often I could just remove the challenge. This really manifested in 2 different ways. First was my ability to simply ignore enemies. Not only was this easy, but the game didn't do much to encourage me not to do it. The levels are big enough that avoiding enemy attacks was easy, and the combination of enemy density and lack of enemy variety made it an easy choice to find an alternative solution. That solution? Simply running through the levels as fast as I could to get to the boss. Sadly, I tested this on the very last level of the game, and sure enough, it worked. Of course, you could not do this, that was my choice to take the route, but with so many enemies blocking my way and not concerned over my level or power, it was an easy decision. I knew I was going to be able to kill whatever bosses at the end of the level, so why waste my time with the fodder? The second issue was one I kind of stumbled upon, and I wish I hadn't, because it completely ruined the game for me. Grenades. Not only are grenades overpowered, but you can purchase them from any checkpoint. On top of that, they're not overly expensive, and with a little farming, you can amass enough to negate any challenge within the game. There is an easy fix here: cap the amount of grenades a player can carry. You would have to address some balance issues there, but it's way better than letting a player run around with hundreds of grenades, spamming them for easy boss kills. Again, you have to make the conscious choice to do this, but to me, it shouldn't even be a possibility. Outside of these 2 issues, I found the action to be rather enjoyable. I wouldn't say it was the best action combat I've ever played, but it was a nice mix of familiar and new experiences that helped the game feel like something unique. What I really loved were the different weapons, the ones that broke away from the norm. They might not be the most overpowered choices in the game, but at least they were different, and different in this case means fun. I do also want to touch on the game's progression system. It's a Souls-like, so killing enemies nets you some XP that you can then use to level up a few primary skills. If you die while holding your Souls equivalent, you drop everything, and you have to run back to go pick them up, or risk losing everything if you die again. The game also features a secondary system that allows players to insert different modules into Aegis to improve some aspect of her combat. You have 4 slots in total, and as you upgrade them with module keys found around the world, you can use higher tiers of said modules. Ultimately, these modules just end up providing more passive stat boosts, but do give you a little flexibility if you're trying to build a character a certain way. I'll be honest, the system wasn't all that engaging. I found what worked for me pretty quick, and while the gameplay is most dependent on the weapons, I didn't spend a whole lot of time tinkering with my modules. I would warn that flexibility does have limits, especially when you start talking about builds for the game. Sure, you can absolutely lean one way or the other, but as far as piecing everything together to create these truly unique loadouts, Well, the game just doesn't go that far. When I finally defeated that last boss and put my controller down, I took a second to let the entire Steelrising experience wash over me. I didn't want to jump right into writing this review because, quite frankly, I needed a beat to process my thoughts. The real truth is, when I finished playing the game, I felt nothing. I hate to say it, but that's the reality of the situation. If we look at the game with a wide-angle lens, I think you'll have a better understanding of why I arrived at that conclusion. As far as the story is concerned, it was interesting at face value, but was weighed down by forgettable characters, heavy-handed writing, and some less than good facial animations. The world was interesting for the most part, but the lack of meaningful exploration and unnecessary complexity made for a less immersive experience than the game could have offered. The combat was really the star of the show. It wasn't the best action combat system I've ever played, but the team did enough to keep the experience fresh, injecting new ideas into the mix that kept the game afloat. Finally, the progression. It was there, it did a thing, but it was a boring journey from powerless robot to one robot revolutionary. The emphasis on pure stat increases just left a lot to be desired. If you look at the game with those 4 things in mind, you might think it was a train wreck, and that's far from the truth. Steelrising is a competent game with some good ideas and some not so good ideas. It's an experience that I think a good number of people will enjoy, but on the other hand, it's not going to resonate with everyone. So with that in mind, is Steelrising worth your time? It's a big fat maybe. I think the game is fine. It's not great, but it's also not horrible. It's a middle-of-the-road experience that will fill the Elden Ring-sized void in people's hearts for now. What the game lacks is the depth and connective tissue that ties the entire experience together. These are the things we take for granted as players, but ultimately take a good game and make it great. For a AA studio to put out a game of this caliber is fantastic, and we should encourage them to keep perfecting their craft. But objectively, is the game a masterpiece? No, sadly not. So there you have it, our honest take on Spider's new game, Steelrising. If you found this worth your time review helpful or enjoyable, do me a solid, hit that thumbs up, and consider subscribing. There are still a few more games coming out in 2022, and if you're looking for a new take on some of the year's biggest titles, we've got you covered. I also want to let you know that our 2022 Leave a Legacy charity event is set for Saturday, October 22nd. For a second year in a row, we've partnered with Connecticut Children's to help bring the joy of video games to kids at the hospital. Mark your calendar, set a reminder, and be sure to join us on Discord to stay up to date with everything regarding our upcoming event. That link, of course, is below. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.